In this video, I'm discussing the journey of Ardra Nakshatra under the lens of the popular fairy tale Snow White. Ardra, which represents transformation through emotional storm, parallels Snow White in that the life contains moments where everything they believed about themselves, about others, or about the world is suddenly shattered. And through that destabilization, a new identity emerges. Ardra is the sixth of the 27 nakshatras. It is ruled by Rudra, a fierce and emotionally intense form of Shiva. Rudra is associated with storms, emotional intensity, destruction, and purification. What's important to understand about Rudra is that his destruction is not malicious. It comes from emotional magnitude. The symbolism of Ardra is described as a storm that breaks open everything stagnant to clear the sky. This is often through destabilization, betrayal, exile from familiar environments, confrontation with painful truths, the collapse of previous identity, and eventually the rebuilding of a new self. Now, when we look at Snow White, the psychological themes of Ardra appear. Key elements like innocence, projection from authority and taking things too far, exile into the unfamiliar or wilderness, the formation of the tribe, betrayal through false nourishment, a symbolic death, and finally, a new awakening. Snow White represents a psychological state. She represents innocence that unintentionally threatens established power. And because of that, she becomes the target of projection. Now, I want to share some of the real life people who have voiced and portrayed the character Snow White. There have been only 4 women to voice the Disney Snow White character. Adriano Casaloti was the original voice, and currently Katie Von Till. All have multiple placements in Ardra. There have been many adaptations of Snow White over the century, TV shows, live action, and spin offs. And after digging deeper, we see that all of these actresses also have prominent placements in Ardra. Prominent examples include Jennifer Goodwin, who plays Snow White in the popular TV series Once Upon a Time, and Rachel Zegler, who portrayed the live action 2025 Snow White and was ostracized by some, including executives, for her way of speaking about the movie, which criticizes the traditional narrative elements. And Kristen Stewart, who portrays in a dark, warrior-centered adaptation. Snow White becomes a military leader with heavy wilderness symbolism and deep exile and transformation themes. And many others, who all have prominent placements in Ardra, have played the Snow White character. Now, in the journey of Ardra Nakshatra, the first stage we'll explore is innocence and what's seen as emotional sincerity. There's often a lack of strategic calculation, at least initially, and high emotional investment. There is little early life strategic maneuvering, which results in their emotional intensity destabilizing systems and others perceiving threat before Ardra realizes their own power. One of the most interesting things about Snow White is that initially she does nothing aggressive. She is naive and emotionally sincere. She doesn't attempt to overthrow the queen or seek power or authority over others. She simply exists. Yet her existence destabilizes the queen. Why? Because Snow White represents something the queen fears losing: youth, beauty, potential, authority, power that the queen wielded that Snow White does not see in herself, all of which could be used to destabilize the queen. In the early Vedic texts, like the Rig Veda, Rudra is childlike and not a fully developed Shiva figure seen in later stories. He is wild and unpredictable, but straightforward and emotionally pure. Immediately after being born, Rudra begins to cry loudly. This crying is a form of vulnerability. Rudra is known to act instantly and directly. If something is corrupt or false, he destroys it. If someone prays sincerely, he protects them. There is little middle ground. This represents innocence, not moral purity in a saintly sense, but lack of calculation. He doesn't manipulate situations for long term political gain the way demigods like Indra sometimes do. Instead, his responses are immediate expressions of emotional truth. This takes us to our second stage of the Ardra's journey, which is projection from authority and themes of taking things too far. The queen sees Snow White not as a person, but as a threat to her identity and power, and so she projects her personal insecurities and troubles outward. This is an important psychological mechanism. Projection happens when a person cannot tolerate something within themselves, so they attribute it to someone else or outside of themselves. The queen fears losing her status and identity. The queen fears Snow White will steal her power through beauty and cunning, but the queen herself gained power through the same mechanism.
It was Snow White who set the bandit free. She's plotting against me. Now tell me, are you against me too?
Now, instead of confronting that fear internally and looking inwards, she turns Snow White into the enemy, wanting to end her life and the perceived threat. Snow White becomes a mirror for the queen's shadow. Whether Ardra natives realize it or not, they destabilize hierarchy and traditional structures. Again, in the Vedic texts, we see the story of Rudra versus Brahma, also known as the creator. In some stories, Brahma begins to develop arrogance, believing himself the supreme creator, and in others, he is running after a young woman trying to procreate with her, acting in vain and infallibility. Now, Rudra, embodying uncompromising truth, confronted Brahma, and in a moment of divine fury, he cut off one of Brahma's 5 heads. This act was done to stop Brahma's ego from corrupting creation. Rudra was, in a sense, created to correct imbalance, even if that meant confronting his own creator. But because of this action, the other gods became afraid of Rudra. Not because Rudra was evil, but because they realized Rudra could not be controlled. He was beyond hierarchy, beyond the politics, and even Brahma was not above his judgment. People with Ardra placements experience similar dynamics appearing in their lives. They become mirrors that reveal things other people do not want to see.
The head of the studio asked me, will you please make room for a white protagonist?
Really?
Yeah, and I said, I can promise you one thing, that all the waiters in this film will be white.
For example, Adriana Casaletto was the original Snow White. She was not credited for her role. It's believed that Walt Disney didn't want to credit her as the voice of the first Disney princess to not take away from the so-called magic. It's also believed he actively hindered her career and blocked opportunities for her to secure future roles elsewhere. Also, Rachel Zegler, who portrayed the 2025 live-action Disney Snow White, was heavily publicly criticized. She received backlash from the public, including disapproval from executives for her way of speaking about the movie and criticizing the traditional narrative elements. Princess Diana, who also had prominent placements in Ardra like her son and Mercury, is also publicly known for her clash with powerful people in the monarchy. Ardra energy, it acts from emotional conviction, it exposes hypocrisy, it pushes reform intensely. But what Ardra experiences as their living truth or authenticity, others experience as destabilizing something they have come to understand and be comfortable in. having seen Ardra natives as taking things too far, or they themselves taking things out of proportion. The third stage is the exile, experienced through conflict and rejection. In the Snow White story, the queen orders the huntsman to take Snow White into the forest and kill her. Instead, the huntsman spares her life and she flees into the wilderness. Now, in cinema, the forest or wilderness often represents the unconscious mind. It's where characters go when their former identity collapses. In mythological storytelling, exile into the wilderness usually marks the beginning of initiation. The person who enters the wilderness cannot rely on the same social identity they once had. They have to discover who they are without the protection of the palace. In the Vedas, after cutting Brahma's head, the other gods exiled Rudra to wander. Rudra had acted sincerely, believing that he was restoring balance, but instead of gratitude, he was met with fear and rejection. And because of this, it's said he felt deep sorrow. Rudra wasn't indifferent to the god's reaction, but the feeling isn't expressed as guilt because the act was righteous, but felt as loneliness. He had been created for a purpose, fulfill that purpose, and yet became an outsider. The sorrow becomes the tears of Rudra, symbolized by the star Ardra. The storm comes first, then the rain. Those rains are Rudra's tears. Similarly, Ardra natives experience moments where they feel removed from previous communities, misunderstood by others, emotionally isolated, and forced to rebuild their identity from scratch. They may begin inside structured environments like families with strong expectations, corporate systems, traditional communities, but at some point, the Ardra storm destabilizes that environment, either through conflict, betrayal, misunderstanding, or speaking a truth that disrupts the system. And when that happens, the Ardra individual often finds themselves outside the structures that once defined their identity. And at first, it can feel like exile, losing belonging, community, and recognition. But symbolically, the wilderness isn't punishment, it's an initiation. Now the question becomes, who are you without the palace? The person must find a deeper sense of self. The next stage is the unconventional support and joining of a community more authentic to self. In Snow White, the first important note is the support and mercy shown by the huntsman sent to kill her, who spared her life. He saw innocence and sincerity in Snow White. He truly saw her and chose to align himself with her, risking his own life. Another main theme is the encountering of the seven dwarves. The dwarves are not members of the royal society. They're outsiders, living in the forest and working with the earth. They're strange, unconventional figures. They're not part of the palace system, but they form a community of their own. For natives, this is experienced through themes of support in their lives, where someone who sees their true nature, accepts their true nature, and shows mercy and love to them. People that others wouldn't expect, receiving help from unconventional places. Ardra individuals eventually discover that their belonging does not come from traditional hierarchies. Instead, they find their tribe among people who are also unconventional, creative and independent, but mostly outsiders in their own way. Another example of this is Daenerys Targaryen in the Game of Thrones series, played by Emilia Clarke, who has her moon in Ardra. Her partnership with Khal Drogo and Dothraki, a wild tribe, was unconventional but brought acceptance and family. And similarly, her strong friendship with the former slave and support from the Unsullied gave her a community and strong support from what she previously knew as family. The Ardra tribe is often formed through shared hardship. These are people who have also experienced exile, people who have also stepped outside the norm, and so the connection between them is not based on status, it's based on authenticity. The fifth stage is betrayal, seen through misplaced trust, as we see with the poisoned apple in Snow White. After Snow White begins to build a life in the forest, the queen returns with deception. She disguises herself to offer a poisoned apple, a famous symbol in all adaptations of Snow White. The poisoned apple represents false nourishment, or a tool to end one version of life before beginning a whole new life. Something that appears beneficial but causes them great pain in ending. This stage represents one of the most painful experiences in Ardra's journey because it involves misplaced trust. Often, individuals encounter situations where someone offers help, friendship, or opportunity, or someone shares a story of their own suffering, but beneath that offer is manipulation, jealousy, or a hidden motive. When the truth eventually reveals itself, it can feel like a poisoned apple, a moment where trust collapses, a moment where the person realizes that something they had accepted in good faith contained harm. This is one of the ways the Ardor storm deepens, because it forces the individual to confront the reality that not everyone operates from sincerity. The sixth stage is the suspended identity and ego death, seen in Snow White after she collapses through a bite of the apple. After Snow White eats the apple, she falls into a death-like sleep. But she's not buried. She's placed in a glass coffin. This is a strange detail in the story, but symbolically, it represents a state of suspended identity. Snow White isn't fully alive in her previous life, but she is not fully gone either. She exists in a kind of limbo state, a threshold between two identities. For Ardra individuals, there's often a moment that feels like their previous identity has collapsed. They may feel disoriented, disconnected, uncertain of who they are, unable to return to their previous life.
I don't like your little games, don't like your tilted stage, the role you made me play, the fool. No, I don't.
But they also have not yet become the new person they are evolving into. This is what we call the ego death. The structure that once defined the self had broken down, but the new identity has not fully formed yet. This phase can feel incredibly confusing because the person may feel or look on the outside calm, but internally they are undergoing a deep psychological transformation. It can be an extremely psychologically challenging moment, not knowing whether you can make it to the other side. Is it an experience of a brief death or permanent? It requires sitting in uncertainty, allowing the old identity to dissolve without rushing to build a new one prematurely. The final stage of the Ardra journey is the awakening to a new power. In the traditional Snow White, we see the kiss as a symbol of awakening, but in modern adaptations of the story, the awakening appears in different forms. It becomes a moment of realization, power, or self-definition. In Snow White and the Huntsman, Kristen Stewart, she returns to confront the queen. She returns as a leader of an army.
All these years, all I've known is darkness. But I have never seen a brighter light than when my eyes just opened. And I know that light burns in all of you! Those embers must turn to flame. Iron into sword. I will become your weapon. Forged by the fierce fire that I know is in your heart! For I have seen what she sees. I know what she knows. I can kill her.
In the live-action Disney Snow White with Rachel Zegler, the emphasis is placed on Snow White discovering her own voice and leadership. Rather than defining the ending through romantic rescue, the story focuses on Snow White stepping into a role where she inspires others and takes responsibility for restoring justice. Through the Vedas and Shiv Purana, we see early version of Rudra evolve into Shiva. Shiva is still powerful. He is still associated with destruction and transformation, but his energy has become integrated and conscious. Where Rudra represents uncontrolled emotional intensity, Shiva presents mastery over that intensity. After deep isolation and meditation, Shiva returns to engage with the world. He is no longer simply a destructive force. He becomes a cosmic balancer. He destroys illusions, but he also protects truth. He disrupts stagnation, but he also restores order. In other words, the storm becomes intentional. And this transformation from Rudra to Shiva reflects the same psychological journey we see in Ardra. Just as Rudra eventually becomes Shiva, the Ardra individual has to move from raw emotional storm into emotional power. For Ardra individuals, the awakening often represents a moment of clarity. The fortified version of Ardra does not depend on external approval. After the storm, they understand their emotional power, their boundaries, and identity. They understand their capacity to destabilize environments, and instead of being confused by it, they learn to navigate it consciously. They understand that not everyone values truth or authenticity the same way they do. and they stop trying to force belonging in places where it cannot exist. They no longer become destabilized by the storm. They become it, an intentional force capable of unsettling even the strongest structures. Ardra Nakshatra's highest manifestation is not belonging, it is fortified sovereignty.